Henry Thorne woke up to a sound that had no right to exist in this world. He opened his eyes in the absolute darkness of his cabin. The clock on his bedside table read 3:33 a.m., the same time he had been waking up for 3 nights in a row. The sound repeated itself, a cross between a snake's hiss and the scrape of metal on glass, coming from deep in the forest. From under his pillow, he pulled out an antique revolver, a family heirloom his father had passed down to him when Henry turned 19. The night his father told him the truth for the first time. 10 days to go, Henry whispered, glancing at the wall calendar, where the date of October 21 was circled in red. The day of the ritual. He went to the window and pulled back the curtain. Moonlight flooded the lawn in front of the cabin, but a few yards away, the real darkness began. The Black Mountain Forest, as the locals called it. Although it had no official name, most maps simply labeled this area in the Appalachian Mountains as a protected area. There's that sound again. Closer. Henry gripped the handle of his revolver, feeling his pulse quicken. In 10 years of living alone in the woods, he had become accustomed to many things. The howling of animals, the chirping of night birds, the rustling of wind in the treetops. But this sound was different. It did not belong to this world. 10 more days, he spoke louder, as if trying to convince someone invisible, and I will perform the ritual as usual. It's too early for you to wake up. He knew he was talking to emptiness, but over the years of loneliness he had gotten used to speaking out loud. It helped him not to forget the sound of his own voice. Henry pulled on his worn jeans, flannel shirt, and heavy boots. Throwing on his jacket, he loaded his shotgun and went out onto the porch. The cold October air hit his face, making him shiver. The forest in front of him was unnaturally silent, not a breath of wind, not a rustle of leaves. He went down the stairs and headed for the shed where he kept his equipment. He took out a powerful lantern and a backpack with the necessary things: a compass, a map, a first aid kit, and, most importantly, a small wooden box inlaid with strange symbols. Every time he touched the box, his fingers went numb, as if from the cold. Inside was everything he needed for the ritual, everything he needed to keep the ancient evil underground for another 3 years. Suddenly the air became heavier, thicker, as if before a storm, although the sky was clear, dotted with stars. His eyes involuntarily rested on a framed photograph on the shelf. Henry, his wife Sarah, 8-year-old Emily, and 5-year-old Michael, smiling, happy, alive. Until that terrible night 10 years ago, when a slippery road, a drunk truck driver, and fate changed his life forever. He turned away from the photo. This was no time for memories. Not now, when something is happening in the forest. Something that wasn't supposed to happen for another 10 days. Henry pulled out a worn leather diary from a drawer, a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations. Flipping through the yellowed pages, he searched for his grandfather's notes on early wake-ups. There had to be some precedents, some instructions on what to do. In his grandfather's handwriting, uneven and clumsy, he wrote down, 1947, October, it moves earlier. A full moon and an earthquake near the caves is a bad combination. I strengthened the protective signs and performed a small ritual to ward it off. It helped for a while. Henry closed the diary. An earthquake. That's right, there was a small earthquake last week, only 3.2, not even strong enough to make the news, but apparently enough to disturb whatever was sleeping underground. The sound came a third time, this time very close, at the edge of the forest. Henry turned off the light in the barn and stood peering into the darkness between the trees. Something was moving there, something big. He raised his shotgun, knowing that the weapon was unlikely to help if it was hoverflowed. It was really awake, but feeling a little more confident with the cold steel in his hands. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement to his right. He turned around. Nothing. Then to the left, nothing again. But he knew for sure that he had seen something. something darker than darkness itself, moving between the trees. Suddenly, there was a crack of a branch very close by, as if something heavy had stepped on it. Henry slowly backed up to the cabin, keeping his shotgun raised. His instinct was to run, but he knew there was nowhere to run. He was a guard, the last of the Thorne family, the last barrier between this world and the ancient horror that slept in the depths. When he reached the porch, he opened the door and quickly stepped inside, closing it behind him. His hands trembled as he slid the heavy deadbolt in. Henry knew that the wooden walls of the cabin would not stop at Thorne, if it did decide to wake up, but it was reassuring. He quickly took out bags of salt from the closet and began to sprinkle it along the threshold, windowsills, chimney, anywhere something could get in. Then he lit 7 black candles, arranging them in a circle in the center of the room, and laid out the pages from his diary with the protective spells written down. When the first rays of the sun touched the treetops, he finally exhaled. The danger was over, at least for today. But Henry knew it was only the beginning. Something had changed. The balance was off, and he no longer had time to prepare for the ritual. It had to be done now. He stood up, feeling his muscles stiff after a night of sitting still. He looked at the picture of his family on the mantelpiece. "I will not fail," he whispered. But deep down, Henry felt a cold, clammy fear. For the first time in all his years as a sentry, he was afraid. For the first time, he was alone, without a father to advise him, without a son to pass on his knowledge. And for the first time, the thing that slept underground seemed to have plans of its own. Having gathered everything he needed, Henry set out for the caves. He knew the way by heart, every turn, every step. He didn't even have to look at his feet. The paths had been trodden so well by generations of thorns. The first signs that something was wrong came when he passed the split oak. The old tree, which had always served as a landmark, half dead, half alive, now completely blackened. Its bark was covered with slime that smelled of rot and something unfamiliar. Something wrong. The birds were silent. There were always birds in this part of the forest, but not today. The silence was so deep that Henry could hear his own heartbeat. The forest around Henry began to change. The trees, which had always seemed to be just old oaks and pines, took on ominous shapes. Their trunks twisted and turned, forming the likenesses of bodies twisted in pain. The branches reached out to him like twisted fingers trying to grab his clothes. The ground beneath his feet became soft, as if something was moving and breathing beneath him. Each step was accompanied by a sticky sound, as if he were walking not on the forest floor, but on living flesh that shuddered under his weight. The fog, which had not been there a minute ago, now crept between the trees, thick, grayish-green, with streaks of black. From time to time, silhouettes appeared in it. Silhouettes of something that should not exist in the world of people. Something ancient, forgotten, buried in myths. Something that was about to wake up completely. The air was filled with the smell of rot and sulfur, so acrid that Henry had to cover his mouth and nose with his sleeve. Every breath burned his lungs, as if he were inhaling poisonous smoke instead of air. Crack. A sharp pain pierced his leg, tearing a scream from his throat. Henry looked down and saw a rusty trap digging into his calf. Blood was seeping quickly through his jeans. He fell to the ground, trying to see the mechanism of the trap. Who could have set the trap here? Damn poachers. And why today? The thought flashed like lightning. What if it was no accident? What if it had somehow influenced the events? Henry took out a knife and tried to unclench the teeth of the trap. The metal creaked, resisting. Blood trickled down his fingers, making the handle slippery. "Not now. Please, not now," he whispered, struggling against the mechanism. Around him, the forest began to change. At first, it was barely noticeable. The shadows became longer, the air thicker. Then the changes became obvious. The ground beneath him trembled. Not like during an earthquake, but more like something alive moving in a dream. A dark liquid began to ooze from the tree trunks. Not resin, something blacker, thicker. The liquid, which moved against gravity, crawled up the trunks. Sounds. Oh God, the sounds. At first Henry thought it was the wind, but the air was completely still. It was more like whispering. Thousands of voices speaking in a language he didn't understand, but which seemed to echo in his bones. Finally, he managed to free his leg. The wound was deep. The trap had pierced the muscle. Henry bandaged it with his shirt, realizing that this would only temporarily stop the bleeding. Panic took over Henry. He realized that the ritual had to be performed immediately. Time was what he needed most. Every minute of delay could cost someone's life. If it broke out completely, no seals would be able to bring it back. For the first time in his life, Henry felt that he might not be able to cope with the task. For generations, his ancestors had been fulfilling a sacred duty by keeping evil underground. And now, because of one carelessness, because of one rusty trap, it could all be over. Normal people never knew that they were living next to something so terrifying that even looking at it could drive them crazy. They slept well only because every few years someone from the Thorne family performed the ritual of renewing the seals. But this time, everything went wrong. Henry could feel it already half awake, feel its hunger, its hatred for all living things. If he did not make it in time, the darkness would swallow everything. Henry limped forward. Every step was agony, but he could not stop. He could not rest. When he finally reached the entrance to the caves, he realized he was too late. The entrance, which had always been no bigger than a door, had now expanded to the size of a hangar. The rocks around it were cracked, as if something from inside had pushed them apart by force. And the darkness. God, the darkness that poured out of the cave was not just the absence of light. It was a substance living, moving, hungry. It spread across the ground, consuming everything in its path. Grass, stones, small animals that had not managed to escape. Henry stood there, paralyzed with terror. In that darkness, he saw shapes, forms that were constantly changing, flowing into each other. Something so alien to human perception that his brain refused to process what he saw. The bag with the ritual tools fell from his weakened fingers. He knew it was too late, that it was over. The darkness spread, moving toward the city, swallowing up the forest along the way. Limping along, Henry tried to catch up with the wave of darkness. Blood was oozing through his makeshift bandage, and every step gave him hellish pain, but he kept going. When Henry reached the top of the hill, he froze, shocked by what he saw. Darkness had already reached the outskirts of the city. Like black ink, it spread through the streets, swallowing up the houses one by one. Even at this distance, he could hear screams, at first isolated, then a chorus of horror rising to the night sky. The windows of the houses flashed yellow and went out, swallowed up in darkness. Car sirens cut through the air with a howl. Chaos. The end. "They're all because of me," Henry whispered, feeling his legs give out. He sank to the ground, staring at the destruction of the city. What could he do now? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It had escaped, and no ritual would bring it back. Henry stood up and limped to his cabin, the only thing he could do now. When he returned, Henry pulled out an old leather diary from a drawer, a chronicle of the watchmen kept by generations of his ancestors. He lit a kerosene lamp and turned to the last blank page. October 18th, 2025. I was defeated. It has escaped, Henry wrote with a trembling hand. If anyone ever finds this diary, know that you may face it again. Hold on to the light. Here are the instructions for the ritual in case it ever lets down its guard again. He described the procedure in detail and provided a list of necessary things. Then he put the diary on the table, next to the knife and the bag of ritual tools. Henry sat down in an old chair by the window and watched the darkness slowly engulf the forest around the cabin. One by one, the trees disappeared as if they had never been there. The light of the lamp dimmed, and the shadows in the corners of the cabin grew thicker and moved as if alive. "I failed," Henry whispered when the darkness reached his doorstep. "I was the last one, and I failed." Darkness crept into the cabin, climbed the walls. Henry did not resist as the black substance wrapped around his legs, body, and neck. At the last moment before it swallowed his face, Henry thought he saw eyes in the darkness. Many eyes that looked at him with hunger and triumph. 3 weeks later, a team of university researchers studying the anomalous phenomenon that had destroyed the town of Ravenwood discovered a small clearing in the middle of the virgin forest with an abandoned cabin. "It's strange," said the expedition leader, looking at the satellite images. "This place is not on any maps. It's like someone erased it." Inside the hut, they found a table with an old leather diary, a strange knife with carved symbols, and a bag of strange objects. But there was no sign of the occupant. The young graduate student, intrigued by the discovery, opened the diary and began to read. His face grew paler with each page. "Dr. Wood," he finally called, "I think you should see this." When they left the cabin, they noticed that the sun had almost set, and in the depths of the forest, where the shadows were thickest, something seemed to move. The graduate student clutched the diary tighter. On the last page, Henry's hand had written, "It's not done yet. It has just moved on to the next place where people think they are safe. If you're reading this, you're the next watchman, and may God have mercy on your soul."